I never thought my wife would throw hot coffee in my face just because I refused to give my credit card to her deadbeat brother. That burning moment changed everything. I discovered their betrayal went deeper than I could have imagined. They thought I was just a wallet to be emptied. They had no idea I was about to teach them both the hardest lesson of their lives. My name is Robert Campbell, though everyone calls me Rob. I'm 48 years old, and until last year, I thought I had everything figured out. I'd built a successful career, owned a beautiful home in the suburbs of Boston, and had been married to Alicia for nearly 15 years. On paper, we were the perfect couple, the kind people look at and think they've got it all together. Our marriage wasn't perfect, but whose is? We had our disagreements like any couple, but we always found a way to work through them. At least that's what I told myself. Alicia was beautiful, smart, and when she smiled at me, it still made my heart skip a beat, even after all these years. I thought we were solid. Alicia had always been close with her family, especially her younger brother Marco. They'd grown up with a single mom who worked 2 jobs, so they'd learned to rely on each other from an early age. I respected that bond, even admired it. Family is important. It's something my old man drilled into me since I was knee-high. So when Alicia came to me that night, in April with worry lines creasing her forehead, I already knew something was up. She sat down on the edge of our bed, twisting her wedding ring nervously around her finger, a habit she'd had since the day I slipped it on. "Rob, I need to talk to you about Marco," she said, her voice tight. I set down the book I'd been reading and gave her my full attention. "What's going on?" "He lost his apartment. The landlord gave him 2 days' notice. Something about the building being sold." She paused, her eyes locked on mine. "He needs a place to stay, just until he gets back on his feet." I felt my jaw tighten immediately. Marco had been getting back on his feet for as long as I'd known him. At 38, he still lived like he was in college, bouncing from one grand scheme to another, never holding down a job for more than a few months. "For how long?" I asked, already knowing what her answer would be. "Just a month, maybe 2 at most. He's got some promising opportunities lined up." I'd heard that line before. Marco always had promising opportunities that mysteriously never materialized. The last time we'd helped him, he'd stayed for 3 months and left owing us money he never repaid. "Alicia," I started carefully, "we've been down this road before." Her expression changed instantly, the worry transforming into something harder. "He's my brother, Rob. What am I supposed to do? Let him live in his car?" And just like that, the battle lines were drawn. I didn't realize it then, but that moment would be the beginning of the end for us. Sometimes the smallest decisions are the ones that change everything. That night, I slept like garbage. I kept turning Alicia's request over in my mind, trying to find a solution that wouldn't end with Marco camped out in our guest room indefinitely. By morning, I made up my mind. The answer had to be no. Over breakfast, I laid out my concerns as calmly as I could. "Look, I understand he's in a tough spot," I said, watching Alicia push her eggs around her plate. "But we both know how this plays out. A month turns into 3, then 6. He treats our home like a hotel and contributes nothing." Alicia's fork clattered against her plate. "That's not fair. He's not some freeloader, Rob. He's going through a rough patch. A rough patch that's lasted his entire adult life," I countered. "When does it end?" Her eyes flashed. "So what's your solution?" "Let him sleep in his car. Maybe under a bridge somewhere. There are other options. What about your cousin Teresa? She has that big house, plenty of room. She lives 2 hours away. How's he supposed to look for work?" I took a deep breath. "He could stay at a hostel while he job hunts. We could even help with that. Financially, I mean. But having him here, it never ends well." Alicia stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "You know what? Forget I asked. I'll figure something out without your help." And just like that, World War III began in our household. For the next week, Alicia barely spoke to me. When she did, it was with a cold politeness that was somehow worse than shouting. She started coming to bed after I was asleep and getting up before my alarm. The house felt like an icebox despite the spring warmth outside. Any attempt to discuss anything, dinner plans, weekend activities, hell, even the weather, somehow circled back to Marco. "I wonder if Marco will get rained on sleeping in his car," she'd say casually, stirring her coffee with exaggerated concentration. The passive-aggressive comments were bad enough, but the silent treatment was killing me. I'd come home from work to find her texting furiously, but the moment I walked in, She'd go quiet and leave the room. At night, I'd lie awake listening to her toss and turn beside me, the distance between us growing despite the inches separating our bodies. After 10 days of this emotional deep freeze, I cracked. It was a Thursday evening. I'd had a particularly rough day at work and came home hoping for at least a temporary truce. Instead, I found Alicia in tears on the phone. "I'm trying, Marco. I really am," she was saying, her voice breaking. "No, don't sleep in your car another night. There's got to be somewhere." She noticed me standing in the doorway and quickly ended the call. I stood there for a moment, feeling defeated. The woman I loved was miserable, and I was the cause. Was I really willing to die on this hill? "Fine," I said quietly. "Marco can stay with us. Temporarily." The transformation was immediate. Alicia's tear-streaked face lit up like Christmas morning. She rushed across the room and threw her arms around me. "Thank you," she whispered, squeezing me tight. "You won't regret this." But even as I returned her embrace, I couldn't shake the sinking feeling in my gut. I already regretted it. Marco moved in the next day, arriving at our doorstep with 2 duffel bags and a winning smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Despite being 38, he still dressed like he was heading to a nightclub. Designer jeans, a leather jacket that probably cost more than my first car, and an expensive watch that seemed out of place for someone who'd just been evicted. "Rob, my man," he greeted me with a backslapping hug that felt forced. "Thanks for this, seriously. You're a lifesaver." I managed a tight smile. "Just until you get back on your feet, right?" "Absolutely. 2 weeks tops. Then I'm out of your hair." Alicia beamed at us both as if we were best buddies reconnecting. She showed Marco to the guest room, chattering excitedly about how she'd stocked the mini fridge with his favorite beer and set up the TV with all the premium sports channels. For the first few days, things weren't completely terrible. Marco kept to himself, was relatively quiet, and even offered to help with dishes after dinner once or twice. I started to think maybe, just maybe, I'd been too harsh in my judgment. Then I came home early from work on day 5 and realized nothing had changed. I found Marco sprawled on our couch in the middle of the afternoon, empty beer bottles on the coffee table, playing video games on my big screen TV. He didn't even look up when I walked in. "Taking a break?" I asked, setting down my laptop bag. He said, eyes still glued to the screen. "Oh yeah, job hunting is brutal, man. Gotta recharge the batteries, you know?" I glanced at his phone on the table. The screen showed a dating app, not job listings. "Any promising leads?" "A few things cooking," he said vaguely. "Got a buddy who knows a guy at this tech startup. Could be big." It was the same line I'd heard from him for years. Always some vague opportunity, some connection that never materialized. Over the next few days, a pattern emerged. Marco would sleep until noon, then spend the afternoon networking, which seemed to consist mainly of texting friends and browsing social media. When Alicia got home from work, he'd suddenly become animated, telling her about all the productive things he'd done that day. And Alicia bought a hook, line, and sinker. "Marco's got a really promising interview next week," she told me one night as we got ready for bed. "With that big advertising firm downtown." "That's great," I said, not believing it for a second. When I suggested Marco might help with household expenses while he stayed with us, Alicia looked at me like I'd suggested selling our firstborn. "He's trying to save money, Rob. Don't be petty." Yet somehow, Marco always had cash for takeout, for drinks with his buddies, for new clothes. It was becoming clear that our temporary arrangement had no end date in sight, and the worst part was that I seemed to be the only one bothered by it. 2 weeks stretched into 3, then 4. The guest room transformed into Marco's personal space, cluttered with his belongings. He'd taken over our entertainment system, rearranged the garage to make room for his bike, and treated our refrigerator like his personal buffet. And through it all, Alicia defended him. Every criticism I raised was met with excuses. Every boundary I tried to set was labeled as mean-spirited. I was becoming a stranger in my own home, and my wife was choosing her brother over me at every turn. As we entered the 2nd month of Marco's temporary stay, my patience was hanging by a thread. Our water bill had nearly doubled, our grocery expenses were through the roof, and somehow my premium whiskey collection was mysteriously diminishing despite the fact that I rarely had time to enjoy it myself. One evening, I decided to have a man-to-man talk with Marco. I found him in the kitchen, making himself a sandwich with the expensive deli meat I'd bought for a client lunch I was hosting the next day. "Marco, we need to talk about your plans," I said, leaning against the counter. "It's been over 6 weeks now." He took a bite of his sandwich, chewing slowly before answering. "Yeah, about that. The job market's tougher than I expected. But I've got something promising next week." "You've been saying that since you got here," I pointed out. "Meanwhile, you're not contributing anything to this household." Marco's expression hardened. "I thought this was about helping family. Didn't realize there was a price tag attached. It's not about money. It's about respect. You treat this place like a hotel, and you're not even looking for work. I checked the job sites you claim to be using. You don't even have a profile set up. That hit a nerve. You've been checking up on me? Who do you think you are, my father?" "No, just a guy paying for everything while you sit around all day." Marco slammed his plate down. "You think you're so perfect, don't you? Mr. Successful with his big house and fancy job. Not everyone has it as easy as you, Rob." I had to laugh at that. "Easy. I worked 3 jobs to put myself through college. Nothing was handed to me." "Right. You pulled yourself up by your bootstraps," he sneered. "The American dream. Well, some of us need a helping hand now and then." "A helping hand is different from free ride," I shot back. "You're 38 years old, Marco. When are you going to start taking responsibility for your life?" He didn't have an answer for that, just stormed off to the guest room, slamming the door like a teenager. I was still fuming when Alicia got home. She immediately sensed the tension. "What happened?" she asked, setting down her purse. I told her about the confrontation, expecting her to at least understand my frustration. Instead, she looked at me like I'd kicked a puppy. "I can't believe you spoke to him that way," she said, her voice tight with anger. "He's going through a rough time, and you're making him feel worse." "A rough time of his own making," I pointed out. "He's not even trying, Alicia. How would you know? You're barely here. You don't see him sending out resumes and making calls. Because it's not happening. He spent his days playing video games and texting his friends." She shook her head, not wanting to hear it. "You've never given him a chance. You decided he was worthless from day one." The argument escalated until we were both saying things we couldn't take back. Alicia accused me of being heartless, of never caring about her family. I accused her of being blind to her brother's manipulation. "If you make me choose between you and my brother," she finally said, "you might not like the answer." Those words hit me like a physical blow. After 15 years of marriage, I ranked below her deadbeat brother. That night, I slept in the spare bedroom. Though slept was generous. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering how we'd gotten here, and if there was any way back. 2 months into Marco's stay, tensions in our house had reached a breaking point. The temporary arrangement showed no signs of ending, and my patience had worn dangerously thin. One morning, I was sitting at the kitchen table, reviewing emails on my laptop while sipping my coffee. Alicia was preparing breakfast, humming to herself as if everything was perfectly normal. Marco strolled in around 10 a.m., looking like he'd just rolled out of bed, which he had. "Morning," he mumbled, heading straight for the coffee pot. I nodded but didn't engage. I'd learned that minimal interaction was the best strategy for keeping the peace. Marco poured himself coffee, then leaned against the counter, scrolling through his phone. After a moment, he straightened up and approached the table. "Hey, Rob, I need to borrow your credit card." I looked up slowly. "Excuse me." "Your credit card," he repeated, as if I hadn't heard him. "I need to make a payment." "For what?" I asked, closing my laptop. Marco shifted uncomfortably. "It's for an investment opportunity. Time-sensitive stuff. I'll pay you back next week." "With what money?" I couldn't keep the skepticism from my voice. "You don't have a job, Marco." "I've got something lined up," he said vaguely. "This is important, man. Don't make a big deal." Alicia appeared beside him, her expression concerned. "What's going on?" "Your brother wants to borrow my credit card for some mysterious payment," I explained. "I'm declining." Marco's face hardened. "Seriously? After everything we've been through as family?" "We're not family," I said flatly. "You're my wife's brother who's been living rent-free in my house for 2 months without contributing a dime." Marco looked to Alicia. "Are you hearing this? Your husband thinks I'm some kind of freeloader." Alicia's cheeks flushed with anger. "Rob, how can you be so heartless? He just needs a little help." "He always just needs a little help," I countered. "And somehow, that help always comes from our pockets." "No, I'm not giving him my credit card." It's just a payment, Alicia insisted, her voice rising. Why are you being so difficult? I stared at her in disbelief. Difficult? Your brother's been living off us for months, contributing nothing, and I'm difficult for not handing over my credit card. The tension in the room was palpable. Marco watched us with a calculated gleam in his eye, like he was enjoying the conflict he'd created. You know what? Alicia snapped, grabbing my coffee mug. You've always hated my brother. Always thought you were better than him. Before I could respond, she did the unthinkable. She threw the hot coffee directly in my face. The burning liquid splashed across my skin, soaking my shirt. Pain seared through me, but I didn't yell or curse. I just sat there, stunned by what had just happened, coffee dripping down my face onto the table. Alicia's eyes widened momentarily, perhaps shocked by her own action, but she quickly recovered, crossing her arms defensively. You deserve that, she muttered, though her voice lacked conviction. I slowly stood up, grabbed a dish towel, and wiped my face. The room was deadly silent as I looked between my wife and her brother. In that moment, I saw them clearly for the first time, two people who would always choose each other, no matter who else got hurt in the process. I'm done, I said quietly, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. When I come back tonight, I expect Marco to be gone. And if he's not, I will be. Without waiting for a response, I walked out, leaving behind the coffee-soaked table, my stunned wife, and the brother who had finally succeeded in destroying my marriage. I slept in the guest room that night, though I barely closed my eyes. By morning, I had made up my mind. I couldn't continue living in a home where I wasn't respected or supported by my own wife. I rose early, showered, and packed a suitcase with essentials. Enough clothes for a week, toiletries, important documents. I was loading my car when Alicia appeared in the driveway, still in her pajamas. What are you doing? She asked, her voice raspy from crying. Taking some time away, I said, closing the trunk. I can't be here right now. So you're just leaving? Running away from our problems? I turned to face her. I'm not running away. I'm removing myself from a situation that's become intolerable. Marco stole from me, and you defended him. That tells me everything I need to know about where I stand with you. It's not that simple, she protested. He's my brother. I can't just abandon him. And I'm your husband. Or at least I thought that meant something. Tears filled her eyes. Of course it does. I love you, Rob. But not enough to stand by me when it matters. I got into my car. I'll be at the Marriott downtown. When Marco is gone, we could talk about where we go from here. As I drove away, I watched her shrinking figure in my rearview mirror. 15 years of marriage, and it had come to this. Me driving away from my own home because a parasite had infected our lives. I checked into the hotel and called my attorney from the room. I explained the situation and asked about my options. He advised me to freeze our joint accounts immediately to prevent any further theft. And if this leads to divorce? I asked, the word feeling strange on my tongue. Let's hope it doesn't come to that, he said. But if it does, we'll be prepared. I spent the day making arrangements, securing a longer-term rental, transferring funds to my personal account, and informing my employer about the situation. By evening, I'd created a financial firewall that would protect my assets if things deteriorated further. Alicia called repeatedly, but I wasn't ready to talk. I needed time to think, to plan my next move. Each time, I sent her a voicemail. On the third day, she showed up at the hotel, her eyes puffy from crying. Marco's gone, she said when I let her into my room. I told him he had to leave. I nodded, relieved but still cautious. And the credit card theft? He says he's sorry. She met my gaze. I know that's not enough, but he promised to pay you back. With what money? He doesn't even have a job. She looked down. I gave him some cash to get started somewhere else. Just enough for first month's rent on a cheap place. Of course she had. Even now, she was enabling him. I want to come home, I said quietly. But things have to change, Alicia. I can't be your second priority anymore. I returned home tentatively, hoping we could rebuild what had been broken. For a few days, things seemed promising. Alicia was attentive, apologetic, and Marco appeared to be out of the picture. We attended one couple's therapy session, where we both committed to putting our marriage first. Then I found the text messages. I wasn't snooping. Alicia had asked me to order takeout using her phone while she was in the shower. A message from Marco popped up. Thanks for the extra cash, sis. Don't tell Rob. My stomach nodded as I opened their conversation thread. What I found shattered any hope of reconciliation. Alicia had been sending Marco money, significant amounts, from our joint account. Worse, she'd been coaching him on what to say to me, how to appear remorseful while admitting nothing. Most devastating of all, she'd helped him work out a plan to borrow my credit card, suggesting times when I wouldn't notice it missing. She hadn't just enabled his theft, she'd been complicit in it. When Alicia emerged from the bathroom, wrapped in a towel, she found me sitting on the bed, her phone in my hand. "You helped him," I said, my voice hollow. "You helped him steal from me." The color drained from her face. "Rob, I can explain." "Explain what?" "How you betrayed me. How you conspired against your own husband." I showed her the screen. "It's all here, Alicia. Every message." "I never meant for him to take so much," she whispered. "He was just supposed to use it for essentials, but he got carried away." "Essentials?" I laughed bitterly. "He was buying a gaming system." "I know it looks bad." "It doesn't look bad, Alicia. It is bad. This is the ultimate betrayal." I stood up, suddenly unable to be in the same room with her. I had been willing to forgive Marco's theft, chalking it up to his lifelong irresponsibility. But discovering my own wife had orchestrated it, that was something I couldn't process. "I'm done," I said quietly. "This marriage is over." She began to cry, reaching for me, pleading for another chance. But the trust was irrevocably broken. No amount of counseling or promises could rebuild what she had destroyed. I packed more thoroughly this time, taking everything I would need for an extended absence. As I loaded my car, Alicia stood in the doorway, tears streaming down her face. "Please don't do this," she begged. "We can work through this." I looked at her, really looked at her, and wondered if I had ever truly known her at all. "Goodbye, Alicia." I didn't just leave my marriage. I strategically withdrew from it. The discovery of Alicia's betrayal had awakened something cold and calculating in me. If she could conspire against me, I could certainly protect myself against her. My first call was to my attorney, who listened gravely to the situation. "Forward me those text messages immediately," he advised. "Then don't communicate with her except through me." I rented a furnished apartment downtown and threw myself into building a fortress around my finances. Years ago, on my attorney's recommendation, I'd established a business structure that kept most of our major assets, including our home, technically owned by my company rather than in our personal names. A company that, as it happened, was majority owned by a family trust domiciled in another state. Alicia had never paid attention to these details, dismissing them as boring business stuff. Now, that lack of interest would cost her dearly. I filed for divorce on grounds of marital misconduct, with the text messages as evidence. Alicia was stunned by the speed of events. Before she'd even hired a lawyer, I had 1. Cut off her access to all company credit cards. 2. Frozen her joint accounts. 3. Changed the locks on my office. 4. Documented every valuable item in the house. When her lawyer finally reached out, his confident tone suggested Alicia expected to walk away with half of everything. He didn't yet realize there wasn't much to split. "Mr. Campbell," my attorney explained in our first meeting, "legally has very limited personal assets. The house, cars, and investment accounts are held by Campbell Enterprises, LLC, which is owned primarily by the Campbell Family Trust. Mrs. Campbell has no claim to corporate property. It wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. Alicia and Marco had conspired to steal from me. Why should she profit from the end of our marriage?" She called repeatedly, texts oscillating between tearful apologies and angry accusations. I maintained silence. The papers would speak for me. 2 weeks after I left, Alicia received an eviction notice. The house was company property, and she had 30 days to vacate. That finally brought her to my attorney's office, her face blotchy from crying. No longer the confident woman who had thought she could manipulate me indefinitely. "This isn't fair," she protested. "That's my home too." "Not according to the deed," my attorney replied calmly. "You never owned it." That night, she called in a panic. "Where am I supposed to go, Rob? You've left me with nothing." For the first time since discovering her betrayal, I answered. "Ask your brother," I said coldly. "You chose him. Now you can live with that choice." The divorce proceedings moved swiftly, largely because Alicia had little legal ground to stand on. The text messages proved her complicity in Marco's theft, undermining any sympathy she might have garnered from the judge. Still, she wasn't going down without a fight. In a desperate move, she hired an aggressive attorney known for finding loopholes in corporate structures. Her new legal team filed motions claiming my business arrangements were fraudulent attempts to hide marital assets. They demanded financial audits going back years. It was a Hail Mary pass that failed spectacularly. My business structure had been established long before our marriage, with meticulous documentation and tax compliance. The judge dismissed her claims and ordered her to pay my legal fees for the frivolous filings. 6 months after discovering her betrayal, our divorce was finalized. Alicia received only what was explicitly in her name: her car, personal possessions, and a small 401k from her previous employer. Everything else remained with me or my business entities. I thought I'd feel triumphant. Instead, I felt hollow. Winning the legal battle couldn't erase 15 years of memories or the pain of betrayal. 2 weeks after the final decree, I was working late at my office when my security system pinged. Someone was at my door. The video feed showed Alicia, looking disheveled and desperate. Against my better judgment, I buzzed her in. She'd lost weight, and dark circles shadowed her eyes. The confident woman I'd married was gone, replaced by someone broken and bitter. "I have nowhere else to go," she said without preamble. Marco took off with what little money I had left. I leaned against my desk, arms crossed. "And you're telling me this because you were right about him," she admitted, her voice cracking. "He used me just like he used you. The second things got tough, he disappeared. That sounds like a Marco problem, not a Rob problem." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "I know I have no right to ask, but I need help. Just a loan to get back on my feet." I studied her, the woman I'd once loved enough to promise forever. Now she was a stranger asking for a handout after conspiring to steal from me. "No," I said quietly. "Your brother taught you that you can take without asking, and there are no consequences. I'm teaching you that actions have consequences. Find your own way out of this mess." Her face hardened. "You always thought you were better than us. Perfect Rob with his perfect life." "Not perfect," I corrected her. "Just responsible. There's a difference." As she turned to leave, her shoulders slumped in defeat. At the door, she paused. "I really did love you, Rob. I just loved Marco more. He was all I had growing up, and I couldn't turn my back on him." "You had me," I replied, "until you chose him over our marriage." She nodded, accepting this truth. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry. Not just for getting caught, but for betraying you." I didn't respond. Words were cheap, and she'd had months to show genuine remorse. This last-ditch apology fell hollow. After she left, I poured myself a drink and stared out the window at the city lights. I felt no satisfaction in her downfall, no pleasure in her suffering. But I did feel something I hadn't experienced in months: peace. I was free from the toxicity, the manipulation, the betrayal. Free to rebuild my life on my terms. The next morning, I called my attorney and instructed him to send Alicia a small settlement. Not enough to bail her out completely, but enough to secure temporary housing and food. Not because she deserved it, but because I refused to let her misery define my character. I was done with Alicia and Marco, but I wasn't done with compassion. That, at least, was something they couldn't take from me. 2 years have passed since my divorce from Alicia, and looking back, I can finally see the experience with clarity rather than pain. What felt like an ending became a beginning, the start of a life rebuilt on stronger foundations. After the divorce, I threw myself into work, expanded my business, and renovated a downtown loft that became my sanctuary. I reconnected with old friends, took up hiking, and slowly rediscovered who I was outside of my failed marriage. Last I heard, Alicia had used the small settlement to enroll in a paralegal program. She occasionally sends brief, professional emails thanking me for giving her that chance. I respond politely but maintain firm boundaries. Some bridges, once burned, should stay crossed. As for Marco, he resurfaced about a year ago with another can't-miss opportunity, this time trying to rope in my business partner. The con never changes, just the target. My partner, forewarned, declined his pitch, and Marco disappeared again. I've learned lessons that no success in business could have taught me. First, trust is precious and fragile. Once broken, it can never be fully restored. I'm more cautious now about who I let into my life, more attentive to red flags I might have previously dismissed. Second, enablers can be as destructive as the people they enable. Alicia wasn't just Marco's sister. She was his accomplice, his safety net, the person who ensured he never had to face consequences. Her misplaced loyalty destroyed our marriage as surely as if she'd set fire to it herself. Third, and perhaps most important, protecting yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary. The financial structures I'd established years ago weren't about greed or control, they were about security. They protected what I'd worked for against those who felt entitled to take without earning. 6 months ago, I met Catherine at a charity function. She's a pediatric surgeon with a quick wit and zero tolerance for nonsense. Our relationship is progressing naturally, without the rush or desperation that sometimes follows divorce. She has her own career, her own money, her own life, and chooses to share parts of it with me, rather than needing me to provide everything. Last week, Catherine asked about Alicia, not out of jealousy, but genuine curiosity about my past. I told her the whole story, not as a bitter ex-husband, but as someone who had processed the experience and moved forward. "Would you do anything differently?" she asked as we walked along the waterfront. I considered the question carefully. I wouldn't have stayed silent so long. I knew something was wrong with the Marco situation from day one, but I didn't want to rock the boat. I should have been firmer about my boundaries earlier. She nodded, threading her fingers through mine. Sometimes the hardest part of loving someone is being willing to risk the relationship to protect it. That insight struck me as profoundly true. By trying to preserve peace with Alicia, I'd allowed resentment to fester until our marriage was beyond saving. I don't regret the end of my marriage. It was inevitable once the trust was broken. But I do regret the years spent trying to accommodate something I knew in my gut was wrong. That's the lesson I carry forward. Trust your instincts, stand your ground on matters of principle, and never apologize for protecting what you've earned. As the sun sets over the city, I now navigate alone, but not lonely. I'm grateful for the hard wisdom earned through loss. The life I'm building now has a stronger foundation, one constructed with clear eyes about human nature and the courage to draw lines that cannot be crossed.